Hi there, and welcome back to part two of the Unmeasured podcast series, all about releasing perfection. I hope that you enjoyed part one. If you didn't have a chance to listen to it yet, I definitely want to encourage you to press pause here and go back and listen to episode 30. In episode 30, we talked about clearly seeing how perfectionism is showing up for you and really identifying those patterns, which is such an important first step. And today we are going to take the second step, which is shifting from judgment to curiosity. So, I today want to help you to gain a compassionate understanding of why you developed the coping mechanism of perfection in the first place, and also to start to help you to create some hope around how you can do it differently. I love to remind you that perfectionism is not who you are. It's not your personality. It is a coping mechanism that was developed to help to keep you safe. And what that might mean for you, could be different person to person, right? What safety means for you could be different, but it is a coping mechanism that was developed out of self protection. It is not who you are. It is not your authentic personality. And so when we talk about releasing perfection, what we're really talking about is feeling safe to let go of that coping mechanism and feeling safe and empowered to practice doing things a different way, to learn new skills to navigate these different moments in your life. I think it's so important to point out that when we are stuck in a perfectionist mindset moment, right? When we are struggling in a moment with perfectionism, and that can look like a lot of different things. It can look like people pleasing. And to me, that's perfectionism in our interactions, in our relationships, right? So, people pleasing, it can look like all or nothing mindset. It can look like perfectionism paralysis, where we feel the pressure to be perfect, but are so afraid that we won't live up to that expectation and that we're going to fall short and fail that we can't even start. Or it can look like really, really high expectations that you have for yourself that you try to maintain at all costs. So, perfectionism, there are a lot of different ways that it can show up for us. But when we are struggling in a moment with perfectionism, all of our energy, all of our mental energy, our mental space, all of it is going towards either trying to be perfect, or the flip side of that could be trying not to fail. And because perfectionism is a really, really limited definition of what is what is right, what is good, and everything else is failure, it can there can be a lot of moments that you might be afraid to fail when you're dealing with perfectionism. And so all of our energy is going to trying to be perfect or trying not to fail. What I want to help you to start to do today is to take some of that energy that you are putting towards trying to be perfect or trying not to fail. And let's use that energy in a different way. I want to help support you to feel safe, to let some of that energy go from trying to be perfect, trying not to fail, and instead rerouting that energy, intention, time, effort, all of that, right? To developing the skills and the tools and the practices to show up for your real human, beautifully imperfect life. Sometimes we spend so much time and effort trying to be perfect that we don't have the opportunity to actually learn and develop the skills that help us to navigate our real, beautifully imperfect lives. As human beings, there are going to be many imperfect moments, right? Our best laid plans are not going to go according to our plans. We may have misunderstandings in our relationships. We may need to navigate difficult conversations. We might make a mistake. We might put ourselves out there and do our absolute best, and things might fall really short of what we had hoped for or expected. All of these things are part of the human experience. And rather than you putting all of your energy into trying to avoid needing to deal with those moments, needing to be in that reality, I want to help you to take a deep breath and step into the reality of the human experience, but also to equip you, empower you with the tools and the skills and the practices that you need to be able to navigate that confidently. So, that is what I am hoping will come from this podcast series. And we are just going to continue to work on that and work through that today. Just like with part one, I want to encourage you to have a journal or somewhere where you might jot down some thoughts, some notes, because I'm going to be sharing some reflective questions that you can take with you to do some personal reflecting, journaling, connecting work, right? So I'm going to post some questions to you, and I would encourage you to spend some time with these questions and see what comes up for you there. So you might want to jot down some of those questions as we are talking through today's episode. So go ahead and grab something to take some notes if that sounds like it might be helpful for you today. So, like I said, we are working on shifting from judgment to curiosity today and also starting to plant the seeds of hope. What is self compassion? In episode 3 of the Unmeasured podcast, I do a huge breakdown of self compassion. I strongly encourage you to listen or re listen to that episode. I think it would be really supportive at this moment in time. And I'm going to recap some of the things briefly that I shared with you in that episode. Self compassion is the practice of offering yourself mindfulness, common humanity, and kindness. So, those are the three elements of self compassion. And Dr. Kristen Neff, the leading expert on self compassion, breaks that down, introduces those elements and those concepts to us. So, mindfulness is identifying what you're experiencing without over identifying with it. So, saying, acknowledging what you are experiencing without making it your identity. Then we have the common humanity, knowing that you are not alone in an experience, that other people may feel the way that you feel. Other people may be going through similar things to what you're going through, right? When we are having a hard time, when we are struggling, when we are in a moment of self-judgment, it can feel very isolating. It can feel very lonely. Self-compassion reminds us of that common humanity, and then ultimately kindness, offering yourself that warmth, that kindness. Those are the three aspects of the practice of self compassion. Now, when I talk about self compassion, I always love to zoom out a little bit. And I love to look at what is going on in our internal ecosystem when we need the practice of self compassion. And this is a simplified version of what is going on in our internal ecosystem. But I love to identify these three parts of ourselves that are interacting in a moment of self compassion, right? We have our inner child. And so that's really, goes down to your subconscious beliefs about yourself that started when you were really young. And many of us who have either identified as perfectionists in the past or identify as perfectionists now developed the coping mechanism of perfection early on in our lives for self-protection. So the inner child part of yourself, right? So those subconscious deep down beliefs that you have, there's the inner critic. So that judgmental inner voice that often pops up and gets really loud in a moment of navigating perfectionism. And then we have the voice of self compassion, which is what we are practicing, what we're working on identifying, getting more comfortable with, and incorporating more often. So I love to just zoom out and see those three parts almost as if it is the 3 points on a triangle, because they are playing off of each other in a moment like this, right? So I want to help you to break it down and identify each of these parts and how they interplay into this conversation around perfectionism. So, in part one, you noted the areas or moments of your life where you experience the pressure to be perfect. So, what I want you to do is you can revisit those moments now, just a quick refresher for yourself. And then I want you to think about, reflect on, journal, however you like to process. Do you remember when a version of this pressure to be perfect first started for you? And this could be like elementary school. It might be when you were a little kid. It could be middle school. So thinking back, when did I first feel this pressure to be perfect? Right. So maybe you think like, oh, the pressure to always achieve more started in elementary school when I realized that getting perfect grades in school, or, you know, being the best athlete, scoring a goal at my soccer game, that was how I got my parents' attention. Like when I was quote unquote the perfect child, that's when they seemed to notice me. That's when the pressure to be perfect, that's when I remember the pressure to be perfect really starting. So just reflect on it. Do you remember when this pressure to be perfect first started for you? And then I want you to think about that earlier version of yourself and ask, what did that earlier version of you, so you can think about it as your younger self or your inner child or whatever words are resonating with you. What did the earlier version of you need to hear the most when this pressure first started? So, using that same example, thinking of that elementary school version of yourself who felt like you had to score the goal to get your parents' attention. What did that elementary school version of you need to hear the most when you first felt that pressure? So, think about that. Then, so that is looking at that point on the triangle of the inner child. Now we're going to shift the point on the triangle of the inner critic. Thinking about that inner voice of judgment that can come up and be so harsh, especially in moments of where the pressure to be perfect feels really intense, right? Like it might call you a failure. You don't want to be a loser. No one's going to like you. You won't have any friends. Like, these kinds of this kind of inner dialogue that can come up for us. And ask yourself, what does that voice, that part of you, what does your inner critic sound like? So just first identify, what does that inner critic language sound like for you? You can name this voice inside of you anything that you want. Um, you can literally pick a real name for it, right? Like you could pick a name. You could call it your inner critic. You could call it your inner mean girl. You can choose what you want to call it. Now that you've identified what that sounds like, I want you to ask, what is your inner critic afraid of? What is this part of you afraid of? Because here's the thing, this part of you is self-protective. It's not, it's not being critical and judgmental because it hates you. It's being critical and judgmental because it's trying to keep you safe. What is this part of you afraid of? What is this part of you trying to protect you from? And what does this part of you really want or desire? So connecting with that voice, and this is going to help you to understand the really good reason that you're trying to that you're trying to be perfect in, this area or any area of your life. So let's get with that compassionate curiosity, let's get to the root of the really good reason why you are feeling this pressure to be perfect. Now we're going to shift to that third corner on the triangle, the self compassion component. I love to think of this as my inner mother. I've also heard lots of clients refer to it as like their inner wise woman. It can just be self compassion. You can call it by a name. Maybe for you, when you think of self compassion, you think of a character in a book or someone in a movie that you love or someone in your real life who you know, and you think, like, oh, that's the voice that I hear when I think about self compassion. So, be curious, go with whatever resonates for you here. You can call it whatever you want to call it. But let's break it down. What might that self-compassion sound like here? So like I said, there's mindfulness, common humanity, and kindness in self-compassion. I will always say that self compassion should be honest. You never have to lie to yourself here. Okay. So you're never going to say anything to yourself that you're like, that is a lie. That is untrue. Self compassion is rooted in truth. Okay. It is very, very wise. There is wisdom there. There is truth there. So just know that I'm not asking you to say anything to yourself that is a lie. For each area or moment where you experience the pressure to be perfect, you can start to identify what does self-compassion sound like in this area. And I really want to encourage you. You could write the scenario where you're feeling the pressure to be perfect. So maybe it's like, I feel the pressure to follow a perfect workout schedule. And that's like an area where you feel the pressure to be perfect. Underneath that, I would encourage you to write mindfulness, common humanity, and kindness. And then identify what each of those components would sound like for you in that area. So let's use the example of I feel the pressure to follow the perfect workout routine. And if I don't, I feel like a failure. Okay, let's identify here. What does mindfulness sound like in that moment? What are you experiencing? I am so afraid that if I don't follow the perfect, I'm afraid that if I don't follow the perfect workout routine, that my body will change and people will love me less. My chest feels tight and I feel anxious. Okay, mindfulness, right? That's what you are experiencing. Common humanity because of diet culture's vast influence and power in our society, many people feel the pressure to control their body with movement. Kindness. What could kindness sound like here? I am a human being in a body that is deserving of care and respect. I can learn how to navigate my relationship with movement, with love imperfectly, right? So that's just an example of what it might sound like. That's an example of self compassion. Then you can put it all together, and that's what self compassion sounds like. I'd love for you to reflect back on what we just talked about in terms of these three corners of the triangle, right? Do you notice any themes for you here? Maybe it's a recurring core fear, a recurring core desire. Just pull out any of those themes here. I know that you might be feeling terrified to let go of perfectionism because it is how you have coped, functioned, kept yourself safe and or successful throughout your life. We are always doing the best we can with what we know at that moment. And there is no shame in having developed perfectionism in whatever form that might be as a coping mechanism. That's what I want to say. It's not about, being mad at our past self or feeling embarrassed that we are challenged with perfectionism or beating ourselves up about this. No, we've all been doing the best that we can, and we developed the coping mechanisms that we needed at that time. And we can really thank our past selves for that. And if you're listening to this podcast series, then that tells me that there is a part of you that says, yeah, this is how I've done things, but it's starting to negatively impact me, or it's, been negatively impacting me for some time. And I want to see if there is a different way for me to do this, a different way for me to experience my life or my relationships or whatever it might be. The answer is that there is a different way. And we are always going to ultimately default to our subconscious beliefs about ourselves, right? In moments of, super high stress or in moments where we feel really overwhelmed, we default to those subconscious beliefs. And so that's why in this work, we always want to have to look deeper than the surface level so that we can start to make sure that we are aligning the way that we're showing up in our lives with those subconscious beliefs about ourselves and learning to see ourselves in a way that really is aligned with our true essence and our values. So now I want to help you to gain clarity and awareness for how perfectionism in any of its forms might be negatively impacting you. And I understand if there are fears that come up around doing this differently, but I want to help you to start to identify other possibilities and start to create that feeling of hope. So let's think about like, what are you not able to do, to experience, to try, to say, or even to be because you have this pressure to be perfect? How do you feel like it negatively impacts you? What is it costing you? And maybe as I just say those questions, things instantly come to mind. And if they do, go ahead and, jot those down, identify them. But if things aren't instantly coming to mind, I want to break this down a little bit more and give you some more specific prompts that might help you to connect with this on a deeper level. It is easy to think of a perfectionist as someone who is always taking perfect action, right? I cannot tell you the number of women who have said, like, I am not a perfectionist. Like, I do not do things perfectly. Perfectionists do not always do things perfectly, right? It's actually common for perfectionism to be an unrealistic or unattainable standard that paralyzes you from doing anything at all because you feel like you'll never be able to live up to that standard. So why even try? You're like, I'm never going to be able to do this perfectly. I don't want to fail. I'm not even going to try. Is there anywhere in your life where you experience this perfection paralysis? And if so, what does it hold you back from? So think about that for a moment. What are you afraid you might feel or experience if you took imperfect action, right? What are you afraid would happen if you did it imperfectly? The pressure to be perfect often leaves us feeling like nothing is enough, right? So, where in your life, if anywhere, do you feel like the pressure to be perfect robs you of the ability to be present, to be present with what is? So, let's say uh, you're struggling with a lot of perfectionism around your relationship with food and you're constantly thinking like what should I be eating? I want to follow, I've got these food rules, I'm trying to follow these food rules. You're so stressed about eating the perfect foods that you are struggling to be present in conversations with the people that you love when you're around a table with them. Or maybe you just got a promotion that you have worked on so hard. You've been focused on it. You've been going for it. You finally get this promotion, but you don't even get to really enjoy it because you instantly start to think about what you need to accomplish next. So, is there anywhere in your life where the pressure to be perfect robs you of the ability to be present with what is? Now, I would love to introduce you to my favorite question of all time, which is what am I making this mean about me? And you know how I shared that we are always going to have moments where we default to our subconscious beliefs about ourselves, no matter how much we might try to, like white knuckle or willpower our way ahead of that in a different way, there's always going to be those moments where we default to those subconscious beliefs about ourselves. This is why I love this question so much. What am I making this mean about me? Because it typically identifies a subconscious belief that you have about yourself that you are projecting onto a particular situation. So, in this scenario, we are going to say, what am I making imperfection mean about me? An example of this might be, oh, if I have a moment where I get frustrated with my kids, I'm a bad mom. Or if I'm not always available when my best friend needs me, I'm not a good friend, right? So think about, what am I making imperfection mean about me? And this is where we get to start to open up some new possibilities. We get to work on the possibility of seeing things differently and experiencing something differently, and acknowledging that there is a different way of looking at a situation that is not through the lens of perfectionism. Once you've identified what you are making it mean about you, then we get to start to open up the possibilities and play around with some reframes. You can ask yourself, what else might it mean that would feel more supportive or more compassionate or even more empowering? So let's say the example with a moment of frustration with your kids, right? What else might it mean about me? If I get frustrated with my kids, it means that I'm human. I can work on repairing with them a relationship skill I really want to develop and I know is important for me and my kids, right? So, what else might that mean about you? Also, oh, if I get frustrated with my kids, it might mean that I'm feeling overwhelmed and need to take a step back and look at where I could ask for help, right? There are so many alternative meanings other than I'm a bad mom. So we want to start to open up those possibilities by asking, what else might it mean that would feel more supportive or more compassionate or more empowering? Now we can ask, if I'm able to embrace this different, more supportive or more compassionate or more empowering meaning, what might open up or change for me? Like if you were to say, you know what, rather than accepting the belief that I am a bad mom because I had a moment of frustration, what if I said, like, oh, I'm human and now I have an opportunity for repair? What might open up or change for me? Well, I might go and sit and have an honest conversation with my kiddo and say, I'm so sorry that I just spoke to you like that. I was feeling frustrated and it wasn't okay the way that I talked to you. I'm really sorry. It might open you up to do that, right? Rather than feeling stuck in the shame of feeling like a bad mom. So, how does this new meaning change what you do next? This is where we get to start to create some hope. Because perfection is a form of fixed mindset, shifting to a growth mindset and connecting with inner confidence can be so powerful. From my perspective, self confidence is just another way of saying self trust, right? If I have confidence in you, I trust you. And so if I have self confidence, I trust myself. And so we want to tap into that in any situation where we are experiencing perfection. So, in any situation where you're experiencing perfection, I want to encourage you to explore, how can you trust yourself here? So, let's say you are feeling the pressure to you got a new job and you're feeling the pressure to show up and do it perfectly. You can ask yourself, how can I trust myself here? And that might look like, wow, I'm feeling pressure to do my job perfectly. When I think about who I am, my skill set, and my past experiences, I know that I can trust myself to ask meaningful questions that help me to move forward with the projects that I'm responsible for. all of a sudden you have a path forward rooted in self trust, right? You can start to write down what would meaningful questions look like around the job that you need to do and who can you take those meaningful questions to rather than feeling trapped there in that moment of perfectionism. And in these same instances, right? What opportunities do you have to practice? Perfectionism is like the antithesis of practice because when we're practicing something, when we're learning something, we are not going to do it perfectly. We are figuring it out along the way. We have to practice. We learn from things not going well. We learn how to navigate and pivot. That is part of the learner's journey. So when we're stuck in perfectionism, there's no space to learn. There's no space to grow. There's no space to practice. So, looking at a moment where you feel the pressure to be perfect and saying, like, what opportunities do I have to practice here? So, let's use the example of the perfect parent. When I'm not putting pressure on myself to be the perfect parent, I can see that I have opportunities to practice patience in moments where things don't go according to my plan. I hope that part two has helped you to offer yourself that compassion in moments of perfection and also has helped you to start to see the potential of new possibilities in those moments and start to create hope as you move forward while empowering you with really tangible tools that you can use in those moments to move forward. We'll be back again with part three soon.